Chapter 3. Taboos related to reproduction. The taboo universally found in man as opposed to the sexual freedom of animals. Later on I shall return to the complementary relationship uniting taboos which reject violence with acts of transgression which set it free. These counterbalanced urges have a kind of unity. From considering the significance of a barrier at the moment of its being overturned, I already have gone on to introduce a group of taboos parallel with those called into existence by death. The taboos centered on sexuality have now to be considered. We have very old traces of customs concerned with death. Prehistoric evidence on sexuality is more recent. What is more, we can draw no conclusions from them. There are Middle Paleolithic burial sites, but evidence of the sexual activity of the first men goes no further back than the Upper Paleolithic art representations. Art representation does not appear with Neanderthal man, but begins with Homo sapiens, and such images of himself as he is left are rare anyway. These images are generally ithyphallic. Hence, we know that sexual activity like death was early on a subject of interest to man, but we cannot deduce any clear indications from such vague data as we can with death. Ithyphallic pictures obviously show a relative freedom. Nevertheless, they cannot prove that those who traced them believed in unlimited freedom in this field. All we can say is that, as opposed to work, sexual activity is a form of violence, that, as a spontaneous impulse, it can interfere with work. A community committed to work cannot afford to be at its mercy during working hours, so to speak. We would then be justified in thinking that, from the first, sexual liberty must have received some check, which we are bound to call a taboo, without being able to say anything about the cases in which it applies. At the most, we could assume that initially the time set aside for work determined the limit. The only real reason we have for thinking that a taboo of this sort must be very old indeed is that, at all times, as in all places as far as our knowledge goes, man is defined by having his sexual behaviour subject to rules and precise restrictions. Man is an animal who stands abashed in front of death or sexual union. He may be more or less abashed, but in either case his reaction differs from that of other animals. These restrictions vary greatly according to time and place. All peoples do not feel the necessity to hide the sexual organs in the same way, but they do generally conceal from sight the male organ in erection, and usually a man and a woman seek privacy to accomplish the sexual act. In Western civilizations, nakedness too has become the object of a fairly general and weighty taboo. But our contemporary experience calls into question an assumption that once appeared fundamental. The experience we have of changes that are possible does not show the taboos as arbitrary, though. On the contrary, it proves their deep significance in spite of superficial changes of emphasis on aspects unimportant in themselves. We know now how mutable are the specific patterns which are read into the amorphous prohibition. This prohibition simply imposes the necessity for submitting sexual activity to generally accepted restrictions. But it gives us the certainty that there is a fundamental rule which demands that we submit, and in common, to restrictions of one sort or another. The taboo within us against sexual liberty is general and universal. The particular prohibitions are variable aspects of it. I am astonished to be the first person to state this so unequivocally. It is ridiculous to isolate a specific taboo, such as the one on incest, just one aspect of the general taboo, and look for its explanation outside of its universal basis, namely the amorphous and universal prohibitions bearing on sexuality. Roger Caillois, however, is an exception to this tendency. He writes, "Problems on which a great deal of ink has been used up, like the prohibition on incest, can only be given a fair solution if they are considered as special cases of a system that embraces all religious taboos in a given society. As I see it, The beginning of Kaiwa's statement is perfect, but when he says a given society, he is still referring to a special case, a given aspect. It is high time we gave our attention to all religious taboos in all ages and in all climates. Kaiwa's remark forces me to state here and now that this amorphous and universal taboo is constant. Its shape and its object do change, but whether it is a question of sexuality or death, violence, terrifying yet fascinating, is what it is levelled at. The taboo on incest. The special case of the taboo on incest is the one that commands most attention, even as far as replacing on a general view sexual taboos proper. Everyone knows that a taboo on sexuality does exist, amorphous and indefinable. All mankind observes it, but this observance is so varied according to the time and the place that no one has found a formula for it that would allow it to be generally discussed. The taboo on incest, no less universal, is translated into well-defined customs always pretty rigorously formulated, and a single unambiguous word gives a general definition of it. That is why incest has been the subject of numerous studies, while the general taboo of which it is only a special case, and from which springs an inchoate collection of prohibitions, has no place in the minds of people whose business it is to study human behaviour. So true it is that human intelligence is moved to consider what is simple and easily defined to the exclusion of matters that are vague, difficult to grasp, and variable. Hence, the taboo on sex has so far evaded the curiosity of scientists, while the various forms of incest, no less clearly defined than those of animal species, offered them what they liked, puzzles to solve, on which their ingenuity could be exerted. In archaic societies, classifying persons according to their blood relationships and determining what marriages are forbidden sometimes becomes quite a science. The great merit of Claude Levi-Strauss is that he found in the endless meanderings of archaic family structures the origin of peculiarities that cannot derive only from the vague fundamental taboo that made men in general observe laws opposed to animal freedom. In the first place, the dispositions concerning incest answered the need to bind with rules of violence that, if it had been allowed a free rein, might have disturbed the order to which the community desired to submit itself. But, independently of this basic requirement, fair laws were necessary for the distribution of the woman among the men. Certain dispositions, strange but precise, are understandable if one takes into consideration the desirability of an ordered distribution. The taboo made it necessary that a rule of some kind should be in force, but the particular rules decided upon could take secondary matters into consideration which had nothing to do with secular violence and its menace to reason and order. If Levi-Strauss had not shown the origins of a certain aspect of marriage conventions, there would have been no reason not to seek the significance of the taboo on incest there. But that aspect simply met the need to find an answer to the problem of sharing out the available woman. If we insist on reading a significance into the general movement of incest which forbids physical union between close relations, we ought first to consider the strong feeling which has persisted. This feeling is not a fundamental one, but neither were the circumstances which determined the forms of the taboo. It seems natural at first glance to look among apparently ancient customs for a cause, but once this research has gone a fair distance, the opposite seems true. The cause we have sought out did not constitute a curtailment of freedom in principle. It could only use that principle for particular ends. We must refer the special case to the whole body of religious taboos known to us and to which we are still subject. Is there anything more firmly rooted in us than the horror of incest? With this also I associate respect for the dead, but I shall not show until later on how all taboos are basically interrelated. We look on physical union with the mother or father or with a brother or sister as inhuman. The persons with whom we may not have sexual relations are variously defined. Yet without the rule ever having been formulated, we may not associate sexually with those who were living in the family home when we were born. This limiting factor would be clearer, no doubt, if other variable taboos, arbitrary seeming to those not subject to them, were not involved. At the centre, a fairly simple and constant nucleus, surrounded by an arbitrary and variable complex, characterises this fundamental taboo. Nearly everywhere can be found this solid core and simultaneously the surrounding fluidity and mobility. This mobility obscures the significance of the nucleus. The nucleus is not intangible in itself, but considering it, we may gain a more acute insight into the primal horror whose repercussions are sometimes due to chance and sometimes coincided with social convenience. It is always at bottom a matter of two incompatibles: the realm of calm and rational behaviour and the violence of the sexual impulse. With this passing of the ages, could the rules which spring from this dichotomy have been defined except in variable and arbitrary forms? Menstruation and loss of blood at childbirth. No less than incest, certain other taboos seem to us to spring from the general horror of violence. For instance, the taboos associated with menstruation and the loss of blood at childbirth. These discharges are thought of as manifestations of internal violence. Blood in itself is a symbol of violence. The menstrual discharge is further associated with sexual activity and the accompanying suggestion of degradation. Degradation is one of the effects of violence. Child rearing cannot be disassociated from this complex of feelings. Is it not itself a rending process, something excessive and outside the orderly course of permitted activity? Does it not imply the denial of the established order, a denial without which there could be no transition from nothingness to being, or from being to nothingness? There may well be something gratuitous about these assessments. Moreover, the taboos seem almost trivial to us, even if we do feel disgust at such unclean processes. They have nothing to do with the firm nucleus of the taboo. They are subsidiary aspects to be reckoned among the mutable elements surrounding that ill-defined central area.